chapter 9. I have just one outline left in case you are interested. I have one outline, so you ask after the meeting. Just a brief outline. We mentioned the last time that the book divides in 3 portions, mainly, roughly. And we are now in the last portion of the book that starts with the word burden, chapter 9. The burden of the word of Jehovah in the land of Hadrach, and on Damascus shall it rest. For Jehovah has an eye upon man, and upon all the tribes of Israel, and also on Hamath, which bordereth thereon, on Tyre and Sidon, though she be very wise. And Tyre has built herself a stronghold, and has heaped up silver as the dust, and fine gold as the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will take possession of her, and he will smite her power in the sea, and she shall be devoured with fire. Ashkelon shall see it, and fear. Gaza also, and she shall be greatly pained. Ekron also, for her expectation, shall be put to shame. And the king shall perish from Gaza, and Ashkelon shall not be inhabited. And a bastard shall dwell in Ashdod, and I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. And I will take away his blood out of his mouth, and his abominations from between his teeth. But he that remaineth, he also shall belong to our God, and shall be as a leader in Judah, and Ekron as a Jebusite. And I will encamp about my house because of the army, because of those that pass by and that return, and the exactor shall not pass through them any more. For now have I seen it with mine eyes. Verse 9. Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king comes to thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, even upon a colt, the foal of an ass. And I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, and the horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off. And he shall speak peace unto the nations, and his dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for thee also, by the blood of thy covenant, I will send forth thy prisoners out of the pit wherein is no water. Turn again to the strongholds, prisoners of hope. Even today do I declare I will render double unto thee. For I have bent Judah for me, I have filled the bow with Ephraim, and I will raise up thy sons, O Zion, against thy sons, O Greece, and make thee like the sword of a mighty man. And Jehovah shall be seen over them, and his arrow shall go forth as the lightning. And the Lord Jehovah will blow the trumpet, and will march with whirlwinds of the south. Jehovah of hosts will defend them, and they shall devour, and shall tread down the slingstones, and they shall drink and make a noise as from wine, and they shall be filled like a bowl, like the corners of the altar. And Jehovah their God shall save them in that day as the flock of his people. For they shall be as the stones of a crown, lifted up upon his land. For how great is his goodness, and how great is his beauty. Corn shall make the young man flourish, and new wine the maiden. So far the reading of the scriptures. This very special book, Zechariah, one of the 3 post-captivity books of the prophets written after the Babylonian captivity, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, divides roughly in 3 portions. The book of visions, chapter 1 through 6. The middle part contains many oracles, and we studied that the last time. And then we have the book of burdens. Just to mention the oracles, we had much about fasting, and in chapter 8 we had 10 oracles. Thus saith the Lord. And we ran out of time, but the last oracle was in chapter 8 verse 23. Thus saith Jehovah of hosts, in those days shall 10 men take hold out of all languages of the nation, shall even take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you. And so we have noticed during our studies that this book has, of course, a meaning for the days that it was written. It has a meaning in connection with the future fulfillment of prophecy, and it has a spiritual meaning for us today. And then, of course, it speaks in a very special way of the Lord Jesus. Like we have expressed in our hymn tonight, the King. He is the King. And we have a special relationship with Him. And so it's always good to remind ourselves of this. And if we find scriptures that speak about the Lord Jesus, what a joy it is for us to know that we have a very special link with Him. If He is going to be the King, we will be the Queen. So that is, you can't get closer than that. So the book of oracles ends there, and I just wanted to mention the applications we have seen, that many practical applications can be taken from a portion like chapter 8, even for today. For example, that there would be a testimony of the truth, that it would be inviting, that others would be attracted. Is it so that others are attracted through us to the Lord Jesus? That is the picture you have in chapter 8. But then in chapter 9 we have a new beginning, and that is really much later. Probably it was written about 50 or 60 years later. Zechariah, we have seen, was a young man. The early part of the book was written while he was a young man. But then the last part of the book was written probably when he was already quite old. And that last part is also different in language, and that's why some believe it's a different author, but it's not at all the case. Of course, it's the same author, but he was much older by that time. And he writes mainly here about the coming of the Lord Jesus. The first part of the book was to encourage the people to rebuild the temple. And that was written, therefore, parallel with Ezra, the beginning of Ezra, to find how the remnant came back from the Babylonian captivity, how they then started to lay the foundation of the temple, but then there was a lapse in activity, and Haggai deals with this. We have seen that when we studied Haggai, and then they were encouraged by Haggai and with Zechariah to rebuild the temple, to finish the building. That took about 16 years. So about 20 years after the return from the Babylonian captivity, the temple was completed. But now the portion that we have before us deals with other matters, much later. So the burden at the beginning of the rebuilding of the temple was not a matter at all. Really, if you would to place it in a historical context, you should place it between Ezra 6 and 7. Ezra 7, you see that Ezra came back. That was a second return. And between Ezra 6 and 7, you can place here the prophecy of Zechariah that he gives in chapter 9 through chapter 14. The expression he uses here, the burden of the word of Jehovah, that expression in total, burden of the word, only is found 3 times in the Old Testament. Here and in chapter 12, verse 1, and in Malachi 1, verse 1. Of course, the word burden is used more often, but the combination of the words burden of the word of Jehovah is only found 3 times in the Old Testament. And that really represents a very special burden he had in connection with the coming of the Lord. So it was like a burden he had lifted, and the message that God gives is also like a burden, and that burden needs to find a resting place. And that is why we find in verse 1, it shall rest. But it shall rest means the word that is here explained will be accomplished. But I want to give you a little bit of background information so that you can follow really the message here. One of the keys to understand the meaning is verse 13. He speaks about the son, thy sons, O Zion, so that represents the remnant in Israel, against thy sons, O Greece. And that represents the upcoming third world empire. Now, I take a lot of for granted, but I shouldn't. You should study Daniel 2, and there you see the big statue, and you see these 4 world empires represented. Before the stone comes down, and the stone represents the Lord Jesus. Now, the third world empire that's represented in the image or in the statue by the bronze or the copper is Greece. As you find in Daniel 7, the third animal, a leopard, that went very, very fast, representing Alexander the Great. So that is the time that Zechariah is speaking about. He is speaking now about the upcoming new world power. Here, in those days that he wrote, Israel was still under the Second World Empire, the Persians. But God was preparing the scene for the third power to come up. We have already seen at the end of chapter 1 those overviews also with the 4 horns and the 4 workmen or craftsmen. And there you find also the order of events in the one empire following the other. So that is one thing. Then what he describes here is Alexander's tour to occupy the different countries. You see what happened, and we know that from history also. The Greek in Turkey, modern-day Turkey, they were oppressed in their circumstances by the Persians, and so Alexander went to help those Greeks. But then he found out how easy the Persians were defeated, and so he went on defeating them. And so he went all through Turkey, and then he went down, and he came to Syria. That's what we have here. And then in the year 333 before Christ, it's easy to remember, 333 before Christ, there was this battle at Issos, and that was really opening the way then to go further down south. And so he came to Syria. Those three cities that are mentioned here, Hadrach, or the land of Hadrach, Damascus, and then in verse 2, Hamath, were parts of Syria. And so that is then, after the battle at Issos, the first part that he occupied. And later, after that, Alexander then died, 13 years later, and that took more years because then there was a battle between the four different generals. But then finally, one of the generals, he would reign over Damascus and that area, Syria, and that is the king of the north that you find in Daniel 11. So you have to study Daniel 11 also to see the whole picture. And in Daniel 11 you see those battles between the king of the north and the king of the south, and how also Israel was involved in these battles. So that is the first point I want to mention. And one more thing is this. When we read this chapter carefully, we will see how God is in control, how God uses these world leaders to fulfill His purposes. You will see that in the next verses. And another chapter that is very helpful to understand this is Daniel 10. In Daniel 10, you see that when Daniel had prayed in chapter 9, the angel came, Gabriel, and he explained then a lot of things. And he explained how there was a battle going on in the invisible world, a battle between demonic forces. And my point is now, even there God is in control. And so what we see on the scene with our eyes is one thing, what's going on in the invisible world is another thing, but in those areas, God is in control. That is the lesson we need to understand. And that is what we will see also here. That is, for example, displayed in a striking way in the beginning of Luke's Gospel. When you see how August, the emperor, gives a decree that in Israel, or in his whole empire, the people needs to be counted because of for the taxes. Then we see also Herod playing a role there. But ultimately, it is to fulfill the prophecy that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. So really, what it all is about is God is going to fulfill His purposes. And that is also here in this chapter. So in verse 2 then, we find then the next target are the Canaanites. So he has subjected the Syrians, and then the next target is the Canaanites, because Tyre and Zidon represent the Canaanite nations. And they were very corrupt, as we know, very much into witchcraft and occult things, but they were also very clever. They were the great people who were who had a commercial empire, as it were, in the Mediterranean. And they had built Tyre. You find many more details in Isaiah, I can't remember now the chapter, also Ezekiel 20, around 26, 27, 28. Many more details in those prophets about Tyre and Sidon. And actually their power was, of course, against God. Not in the early days, like the days of Solomon, we find that the king of Tyre and Sidon had made an agreement with Solomon and was much in favor of Israel. But here at that time, that was a different picture. But God allows this tremendous power to be occupied now by Alexander. And just to give you a picture of what that means, Tyre was so strong, they had their own city on the continent, but then they had built a fortress on an island nearby. So that was in the sea. And that island was fortified with a wall 150 feet high. So that was impregnable. Nobody could take that fortress. When Shalmaneser, the king of the Assyrians, had tried to take it, that took him 5 years, and after 5 years he needed to retreat. He could not take that fortress. When Nebuchadnezzar came, and he occupied all those countries, and he went even on to Egypt, he tried for 13 years. Imagine a siege of 13 years, and he did not succeed. Now, and God gave, therefore, to Nebuchadnezzar other countries as his wages, as his salary. You can find that also in Ezekiel. But now, Alexander the Great came, and within 7 months, he had taken that fortress. It says here in verse 2 at the end, Sidon, though she be very wise. They relied on themselves, and they had reason to do that because nobody had been able to take them. But now, God's time had come, so that they were going to be taken by Alexander the Great. It says in verse 3, Tyre has built herself a stronghold. That is the stronghold that I was just mentioning, the island in front of Tyre. And the word stronghold is a word play on the word Tyre. In the Hebrew, it's very close. So they were very strong, therefore arrogant, and now God's time had come to punish their arrogance. And it says, has heaped up silver as the dust. They were a commercial power that even afterwards, after this defeat, they still continued on, and in the time of the Roman Empire, they were still of great importance, till they were defeated then in the battle against Hannibal and the Phoenicians. But the Phoenicians really came from Tyre and Sidon originally. Then verse 3 shows the tremendous riches they had, and they relied on their power and riches and wisdom. Great architects, great merchants, they were very wise. But then in verse 4, what do we see? Behold, Alexander the Great will take possession of her. Did I read it right? What does it say? The Lord will take possession of her. So now my point that I said earlier, God uses the emperors, the world empires, as his instruments. God used Alexander the Great to take possession of Tyre. That is the point, as you find then in Ezekiel and Isaiah, as I said earlier. And he will smite her power in the sea. That is the stronghold they had in the sea, the island, and that was then also devoured by fire, with fire, as this says here. And that's also quoted in Amos. In Amos, that was also predicted. Well, in the beginning, when Alexander came down, they were not so much afraid, of course, for him. But now, when Tyre had fallen, now the Philistines also got scared. Because then he came down to the Philistines, and Philistines were also very proud. In verse 5 it says, Ashkelon shall see it and fear. Of the 5 cities, only 4 are mentioned. There were 5 cities of the Philistines, only 4 are mentioned here. Maybe Gath, that is not mentioned, had already disappeared by that time or was of no importance. But anyway, the 4 that are mentioned are all taken, and we see that it says, Gaza also, and she shall be greatly pained. Ekron also, for her expectation shall be put to shame. They had expected that Tyre would resist, that Tyre would not be taken, but they had been mistaken, and now it's their turn to be occupied, to be taken. And then the king shall perish from Gaza. That was the top leader of the Philistines, the representative. Of course, every city had its own king, but then the king of Gaza was the top leader of the Philistines at that time. And he was taken by Alexander behind a chariot and just pulled through the city. And then he died, of course, this king. It was very humiliating. And so God used Alexander to humble the proud Philistines. And that is why in verse 6 it says, a bastard shall dwell in Ashdod. The Philistines were very proud to keep also their line of ascendants clean, not a mixture with other nations, but God allowed here that a bastard, a mixed race, would dwell in Ashdod, as we find also in Nehemiah 13. That happened later, historically. This Ashdod is the if I'm not mistaken, as Azote you find in Acts 8, where Philip the evangelist has worked. So he has worked in this area late. And now notice what does verse 6 say? I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. That's what God says. So you connect verse 4, the Lord will take possession of her. You connect it with verse 6, I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. God is at work, but he uses Alexander the Great. And then, verse 7, I will take away his blood, the blood of the Philistines. No, excuse me, the blood that they used for their rituals and sacrifice. Here the blood is representative of what the Philistines used to do. When they would occupy Israel or their enemies, they would use those victims and sacrifice them for their idols. And that's referred to in verse 7 in the middle, his abominations from between his teeth. That is a reference to this idolatrous practice. But, and now notice the grace of God. What does verse 7 in the middle say? But he that remaineth, even in the Palestinians, there would be a remnant. He also, I use now the word Palestinians, I should not use that. The Philistines that remains. But why did I say Palestinians? Because the Philistines that you have at that time are the Palestinians that you have in our day. And so what we see here is that God will have a remnant even of the Philistines. And I call them the Palestinians of today. There will be a remnant that God will introduce into the millennial reign. It says, he also shall belong to our God. So that means that God will have a remnant even among the Palestinians and shall be as a leader in Judah. So they will have a role among Israel. Now today that's impossible, and there is a lot of fighting about this issue. That cannot be realized before the Lord, the King of Peace, will rule. Before that, this cannot be realized. By the way, Judah, if you read Joshua 15, you see that those cities, Ashdod and Gaza and so on, really belong to Judah's territory, but they have been usurped by the Philistines. But God's grace is that He will have a place for the Philistines or the Palestinians, as we see in our days, among His own people in the millennium. And similar thoughts we have in Isaiah, how there will be peace between Syria and Egypt and Israel together, and there will be this highway, communication in God's presence. And then it says at the end of verse 7, and Ekron as a Jebusite. Ekron was one of the other cities there, and a Jebusite refers to what David did. When David ruled, we find that there was peace between David and Ornan, the Jebusite. That's one example how then these originally Canaanite nations, some were preserved and then absorbed in God's people. And so it will be in the millennium that even some of these Palestinians there, they will be among God's people and absorbed in them, as it were, or merged with them. And then in verse 8, I will encamp about my house. Now this is an important verse for us to understand. God is going to encamp around His house. We have seen that on chapter 2 already, that God gave this promise, I think in verse 5. I, saith Jehovah, I will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her. So then the temple was not finished yet. The wall was not finished yet, as we find in Nehemiah. But here the point is, God, turn back to chapter 9, verse 8, God would encamp. He would protect His house. He would protect His city. Now why? Because of the army, because of the threat. Now go back literally to the situation. Alexander the Great, he was invading all those nations. So what would be the next turn? Judah, Jerusalem. But what had happened? See, when Alexander was trying to take Tyre, he had asked for help from Jerusalem, support. And he also asked that they would stop paying their taxes to the king of Persia. And the high priest who was ruling in Jerusalem did not want to be unfaithful to the king of Persia, and so he refused to do that. But now Alexander is coming. And so now they were quite scared there in Jerusalem. And it seems from a book of Josephus that the high priest had a dream that he should go out with the priests and meet Alexander. And that is what happened. God used two things. Alexander later on he said, I bowed down for that high priest, but really I bowed down for the God he represented. Alexander claimed that he had seen a dream in his country when he was still in Greece, that he was going to invade all those nations, but that it was God who gave him the orders. Well, we can prove that that is true, but that is what Alexander said. What we know is that God is in charge. That is what we know. We know that God would protect His city. And so God did not allow at that time that Jerusalem was taken, whereas all these other cities were taken. God protected them. But now, to come back to the prophetic line, this was literally prophecy in Zechariah's day. When he wrote this, it was not. It was still future. But now, of course, we look back and it has been fulfilled. The city was not taken, just according to those prophecies. But now the second application is the future. God will protect His house also in the future. And so we go to the Great Tribulation and we see how God will protect His people. Well, the house literally will be the house of God, but then the Antichrist will reign there, and this house will be destroyed, according to Daniel 9. At the end, Daniel 9 verse 27, we see it will be destroyed. But God will protect His people. And there will be a remnant in Jerusalem, as you find in Isaiah, I think 29, called Ariel. God will protect a remnant there, and they will be preserved by God. God will encamp. And so, I think the final fulfillment is the millennium. God will protect His house even in the millennium. And we will come back to that in chapter 14, Lord willing. And then it says, at the end of verse 8, the exactor shall not pass through them any more, for now have I seen it with mine eyes. God is looking on His people. The fact that God is seeing these things reminds me of Exodus. when the people was in bondage in Egypt, God had seen their affliction. So God had seen the situation in the days of Zechariah and after. God will see the situation in the Great Tribulation, and God will take care of His people. They are the apple of His eyes, and God commits Himself to them. Now we come to the second part of this chapter, verse 9. Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Why should they rejoice? Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. Why should they shout? Jerusalem, the city of the great king. Matthew 5 mentioned that it's the city of the great king. In Jerusalem, as I said earlier, there will be this little remnant that you find, I think I mentioned it the last time in Zechariah 3, verse 12, I will leave in the midst of thee an afflicted and poor people, and they shall trust in the name of Jehovah. That remnant will stay there while the people from Judea, according to the instructions the Lord has given in Matthew 24, will flee. So the majority of the remnant will flee, but there will be a remnant that stays in Jerusalem. Like we find also in Revelation 11, the prophet, the faithful messengers there that God leaves there, the two witnesses in Revelation 11. They represent that remnant that stays there. But now, when we go to the Gospels, we see that this prophecy was partly fulfilled when the Lord entered the city of Jerusalem. And that's again an important point, because that was the fulfillment of Daniel's weeks. Daniel 9, you see those 7 and 62 weeks together, 69 weeks. That period was fulfilled at the moment that the Lord entered, and then there is a gap. And then the 70th week will start, well, after the rapture. We don't know exactly when, but God knows when that week will start. And that's then explained in the end of Daniel 9. But my point is now that at that moment, this prophecy was also fulfilled. Behold, thy king cometh to thee. And that's why it is quoted in Matthew 21. This verse is quoted, but there is an important difference, and I just wanted to ask your attention for that. In Matthew 21 it says, verse 5, Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, thy king cometh to thee, meek and mounted upon an ass. It doesn't say he is just and having salvation. And so my suggestion is that is still future. If the Lord would have acted as a righteous king, then he would have acted in judgment right away. But he did not do that in Matthew. He acted in meekness, just as he explained in Matthew 5 and in 11. And when we turn to John 12, where we find this same passage quoted also in John 12, when the Lord came to Jerusalem, in verse 15, it says, Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, thy king cometh, sitting on an ass's colt. That's all that's quoted from this prophecy. So my suggestion is that the prophecy itself, dealing with the first coming of the Lord Jesus, has, as it were, already in itself two levels of application. There is a first level of application that goes together with the king coming in humiliation upon an ass. Imagine Alexander also came there, and I forgot to finish the story. When he came there, when the high priest came out and bowed down before him with all his priests following him, Alexander spared the city and did not destroy the city. And then it seems that the high priest even showed him from Daniel 11 that God had predicted his coming, but we don't know again of whether that was sure. But we know for sure that the city was not destroyed. But now here in verse 9 we see the coming of the Lord then in time, in connection with the fact that he was lowly. The word lowly implies also the thought of afflicted, and it is used in chapter 11 verse 7, So I fed the flock of slaughter, truly the poor of the flock, or the afflicted of the flock. See, the Lord took a place of lowliness, as you find in the baptism of John the Baptist. He identified with the lowly, with the afflicted, who had humbled themselves, who had repented, and the Lord took a place in humiliation among them. Also in Zechariah 11 verse 11, and it was broken in a day, and so the poor of the flock that gave heed to me knew that it was the word of Jehovah. So the Lord identified with the poor. He identified with the lowly and the afflicted. That is in connection with his first coming. But the emphasis on his righteousness is not, as we have seen in Matthew and John, yet. That is in connection with his second coming. He will come in righteousness. Isaiah 7, 9, 11 and especially 32, a king will reign in righteousness. And then also, then there will be salvation. It is remarkable how many times we find in Isaiah righteousness connected with salvation. You can study that. That is very remarkable. But that is still future. So that aspect of righteousness and salvation is still future. And so I just ask your attention for that. We have to read the prophecies very carefully, and we will see that also when we come to verse 10, because sometimes in one verse there is these two levels, connection with the first coming and the second coming, or there is one verse referring to the first coming and the next verse is referring to the second coming. For example, sometimes also in one verse, a child is born, the son is given. There you have the same thought. The child in connection with the first coming, the son in connection with the second coming. Of course, there also it implies that child, manhood, son is deity. But to come back now to this verse 9, it says also lowly and riding upon an ass. Imagine Alexander on an ass. It's impossible. You can't fathom that. Alexander would come on a horse of war. He would not come lowly and riding upon an ass. The coming of the Lord Jesus in humility, I think, was already indicated in Genesis 49, but you can check that in Jacob's prophecy. But however it may be, even the Jewish rabbis understood that many of them understood that this verse refers to the coming of the Messiah. But they now don't want to accept that the Lord, when he came, he was the Messiah. They are still looking for his coming. And so they were confused. They were thinking of the Messiah, and then they saw Daniel 7, the Son of Man, coming with the cloud, and then they would read other verses like this, lowly and in some humiliation. So they came up with a theory. The one is Messiah ben Joseph, the other in glory is Messiah ben David. But of course that doesn't solve the problem, because it is the same person, and that is what we need to understand. But in connection with two comings, although these two comings are really linked together, and at the same time there is a tremendous gap, and that's what you find in verse 10. The gap means there is a tremendous lapse of time in between. How could I illustrate that? What helped me a lot is this. The first coming of the Lord has been compared to the mountaintop. And the prophets of the Old Testament, they saw the coming of the Lord, even those rabbis that I talked about, they saw the coming of the Lord in humiliation. Then they saw the prophets of the Old Testament, as referred to in 1 Peter 1 also, they saw the King in glory, the Messiah. Isaiah says, my eyes have seen the King. And so there are many references to the King in glory. Psalm 45 and many others. And so that is the second mountain. The prophet saw these two mountains. And when you look, well, not here in Toronto, but when you go to an area where there's mountains, that can happen, that you see one mountain and then way further you see another mountain top. But you don't see what's in between. Now that is the gap that I was talking about. The prophet did not see the gap in between those two mountain tops. But the gap is indicated by the Lord himself in Luke 4, for example. He speaks and quotes Isaiah 61, the year of grace, my free translation, and then the Lord stops there. He does not speak of the day of wrath, because the day of wrath was still future. And you see, when the year of grace started, and when the day of wrath will take place, is almost 2,000 years different in time. That's a tremendous gap. That is what we need to understand. That is what we need to understand also when you read Daniel 9 about the difference between the 69th week and then when the 70th week starts. There is this gap. Now that is also illustrated in verse 10. And I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem. We understand immediately that this is still future. We could understand from Matthew and from John that that verse 9 refers to the first coming of the Lord, although it also refers to the second coming, as I explained earlier. But verse 10 can only refer to his second coming. That is my point. And so there is then this tremendous gap in time in between both prophecies. That is what we really need to understand. And then notice, I want to ask your attention for this mystery also. Verse 9 says, behold, thy king cometh. Then verse 10 says, I will cut off. And then verse 10 at the end says, and he shall speak peace unto the nations. It's the same person. The king, I, and he is the same person. It's Jehovah himself. This is mystery of mysteries, and we have seen that so many times already in this book. And here we see then the introduction of the millennium, of course. He shall speak peace unto the nations. Mordecai in Esther 10 is really a wonderful illustration of this. And this is what we have expressed in our hymn about his domain from sea to sea, from the river to the end of the earth. That is what you find in Psalm 72. So here, in Psalm 72, that ends the second psalm book about the tribulation period, introduces then the glorious reign of the Messiah. He will come back. Hebrews 9 says it, but not in connection with the question of sin. He will come back in glory, and he will reign, as it says here, from the river to the end of the earth. That has never happened. Not even in the glorious days of Solomon. He had, part of his country was from the river Euphrates, but not to the end of the earth. Then verse 11, as for thee also, by the blood of thy covenant, I will send forth thy prisoners out of the pit. God is speaking now here in giving some more detailed promises, but it is on the basis of the blood of the covenant. That is, first of all, a reminder of Genesis 15, where God made that covenant with Abram about the land of his promise. Read Genesis 15, you see how the blood plays a role there, how God committed himself to Abram on the basis of the sacrifice. That was also mentioned in the hymn. The sacrifice is the basis for blessing. Exodus 24, we find how Moses initiated the first covenant with blood, but that blood would ask for judgment because they would be unfaithful. So I would submit to you that even here in this expression, it would be implied the thought of the new covenant, the blood of the covenant, as the Lord speaks about this in the gospel. That is really the basis for the fulfillment of all God's promises for Israel. And it says, I will send forth thy prisoners out of the pit, wherein is no water. That shows how God preserved the nation of Israel. Even the 10 tribes scattered, nobody knows where they are. The 2 tribes who have been identified during those 2,000 years after the second destruction of the temple in the year 70. God preserved them in a pit wherein is no water. Like Joseph was put in a pit with no water, God preserved him. Jeremiah was put in a pit. God preserved him. These are illustrations of the same principle. But they will be released, and it says in verse 12, turn again to the stronghold. What is the stronghold? Difficult question. Jerusalem. Here the stronghold is Jerusalem. It's not Tyre that has its own stronghold. Here the stronghold is Jerusalem. And so here now, I want to use that as an example to show the different levels of the prophecy. Literally, in Zechariah's days, this appeal, turn again to the stronghold, was an appeal to the Jews who were still in Babylon, whom God preserved there in a pit where there is no water. They were still in the Babylonian captivity. So, first appeal is to them. But then, of course, we understand, secondly, it is an appeal to those who will be scattered in the Great Tribulation. And they are prisoners of the hope. That's what it literally says. The hope connected with the Messiah. And, of course, on the basis of the blood of the Lamb. We find many more details about that also in Revelation. So I mentioned already earlier, there will be a remnant in Jerusalem. The Lord will preserve them. But there will be others who will be scattered again. And the appeal comes to them to go back to Jerusalem. That is at the beginning of the millennium. So here is again an example how prophecy has these different levels of. And then it says, at the end of verse 12, even today do I declare I will render double unto thee. This is a promise that although they had suffered double, and we read in Isaiah 40 that God would chastise them double, that God will also pay back in grace, in blessing, in a double way. That is mentioned in Isaiah 61. This is the portion of the firstborn. You remember in the Old Testament, the firstborn had a double portion. And so Israel will be the firstborn with a double portion. That is what we have here, the double portion of the firstborn. Israel will be the firstborn, and all the nations will be blessed. We talked about Egypt earlier, Syria, even the Philistines, they will all be blessed. But Israel will have the first place. That is the point. A double portion of the firstborn. Now, may I apply today to us? We belong to the church of the firstborn. We have a double portion already today. And a double portion that is even greater than the double portion that Israel will have on this earth. That is a wonderful blessing for us. Then verse 13, now God speaks here through Zechariah about the future remnant that he is going to use. The Lord is going to use the future remnant as an instrument. We said earlier God has used the emperors of the great empires as his servants. And so the Lord is going to use the future remnant as his bow, as his instrument. Read verse 13. I have bent Judah for me, bent as an arc, as a bow. I have filled the bow with Ephraim. There is the 10 tribes. So you see them together now. The 2 tribes and the 10 tribes together those who will be preserved by God, who will then enter the millennial reign, they will be used at the beginning to chastise other nations, as we know from many, many prophecies. And I will raise up thy sons, O Zion. Okay, but now, again, these manifold applications. Here, I think, first of all, it refers to the Maccabees. The Maccabees, in the days about 200 years later than Zechariah wrote, between 200 and 300 years later, they stood up against the descendants of Greece. What does it mean? The sons of Greece. The king of the north, as I said earlier, was really one of Alexander's generals. And so his descendants are called, therefore, sons of Greece. That is a reference to the descendants of the king of the north. And one example, and therefore you turn back to Daniel 11, you find that whole range of descendants from the king of the south, the king of the north, and all those battles. In the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, it got so bad that the Jews said, this is it. He sacrificed a pig in the tent. And so from then there was a revolt, and then the Maccabees took over and cleansed the temple, and so on. That is the first reference. I will raise up thy son. That's the first reference that was still prophecy at that time, is now fulfilled. And that is also what you find in Daniel 11. Daniel 11 till verse 28 is all history. Then from verse 29 to verse 35 you find references to the Maccabees. And then from verse 36, the king, future, the Antichrist is still future. And so there again, Daniel 11 have these two levels. What was fulfilled in the Maccabees, what is going to be fulfilled in the future remnant. And so the second meaning would be, in the future, then there will be again a battle. And as I said earlier, the Lord will use the remnant to chastise the surrounding nations. And then again, you see how this will be fulfilled, because literally in the days of the Maccabees, it was only from Judah. But here it says, I have bent Judah for me and filled the bow with Ephraim. So that must be future, and that is still to come at the beginning of the millennium. That is then the ultimate fulfillment, when the stone will roll down and the statue will be destroyed, as we have in Daniel 2, and make thee like the sword of a mighty man. Now then verse 14, Jehovah shall be seen over them. The Lord will reign in glory over them. He will use them, as I said earlier, as his instrument, but then it is connected with the Lord's reign in glory. That's the same king we have in verse 9. It is wonderful to see how the Lord's humanity and his divinity are even referred to in this chapter. There was another reference, I hope I can find it back, where he's called Lord Jehovah. Did anybody see that? Because that was in the chapter that we have read. Yeah, in verse 14. The Lord Jehovah will blow the trumpet. So there you have a reference to the Lord, that is his manhood, Christ as man, Jehovah, there you see him as God himself, blessed forever. So again, there is a reference to this wonderful mystery of the Lord Jesus in his humanity and in his deity. And he will blow the trumpet. You'll find many references, Psalm 81, for example, to this trumpet, and also in Isaiah 27 and other places. So he will blow the trumpet, but he is going to use the remnant, as I said earlier, for his purposes. And there will be a lot of turmoil. He says, I will march with whirlwinds of the south. A lot of destruction in this time of judgment. Today, of course, the Lord wants to use you and me as his instruments, but it is in grace, it's not in judgment. That's the great difference. Verse 15, Jehovah of hosts will defend them, and they shall devour and shall tread down the slingstones. I want to ask your attention to two things now. First of all, the two sides. Jehovah of hosts will defend them. So there we see God's side. But then, they shall devour. That is their side. That always goes together. God's work, man's responsibility. Second point I want to underline is again this second level, the two levels. God defended them, the Maccabees, the story of the Maccabees, that was still future when Zechariah wrote, as I said earlier. And ultimately, of course, the Lord will defend them during the Great Tribulation and after. This is a difficult verse, verse 15, about the sling stones, and they shall drink and make a noise as from wine, and they shall be filled like a bowl, like the corners of the altar. It's like God sees, as it were, this whole enterprise also as a sacrifice, that the nations will be like a sacrifice for him, and at the same time there will be satisfaction for Israel. But then verse 16, Jehovah their God shall save them in that day as the flock. You notice that? As the flock of his people. We'll see much more, Lord willing, in chapter 10 and 11 and 13 about the flock and about the shepherd. Here they are already compared with a flock, the flock of his people. And today we belong to that flock. John 10, many other passages of course come to mind, but this is a precious thought. And you know, here again, there is the link between the Lord as a shepherd and his flock. That is the secret. He will not give them up, as he does not give up his flock in John 10 either. Then it says in verse 16, for they shall be as the stones of a crown. Now the emphasis is on what they mean for him. We have seen earlier they will be used as his tools to subject the surrounding nations, but they will also be for his display, for his glory. Stones of a crown. Wonderful. He will use them for his own glory. Now, we can apply that to us too. The Lord will use the believers in a very special way for his own glory. Many passages, but 2 Thessalonians 1, and he will be glorified in his saints and sons. And so many more passages confirm that. Then verse 17, for how great is his goodness and how great is his beauty. This is to sum it up. That is the conclusion. How great is his goodness. If you go over this whole chapter, you can only be amazed by the goodness of the Lord and his beauty. And then the last word of restoration. Corn shall make the young man flourish. Here we find again the reference to restoration. And perhaps even a reference to resurrection. Because, as you know, for corn to grow, it takes first death, as the Lord explains in John 12. And so here we see how the remnant will be placed on a new basis, the base of resurrection. And then there will be restoration. Today, you and me, we are placed on the base of Christ's resurrection already. And we enjoy the corn that is the fruit that he provides, John 6, and many other passages. It makes the young man flourish. He wants the young man to grow. And that's literally, but of course spiritually the case for each one of us. He wants the young man, 1 John 2, to be strong. Paul wanted the man to be strong, Colossians 1 verse 28. That was his purpose. Mature, strong man. And so the Lord will have his testimony. The man will flourish. And the new wine, the maidens. So that new order of things the Lord is going to introduce will also be seen then in the women that represent the subjective side of the nation, the responsive side. Both sides are there. Responsibility, man, the response side in the women. And that's still the case for us today. We may drink in the wine of his joy and may respond to his goodness, respond to his beauty. So that was just a short summary of this chapter, but it really struck me how rich the scriptures are. And I would like to give you an opportunity to ask questions, because I will not blame you if you feel confused, but if you are confused, come up with a question and we'll try to set you straight. But I hope it was not too confusing what I presented. You tell me.
The question about the reference to the masterpiece of God, like I'm not referring to that also it didn't come too much of anything. I mean, I read very little about it, but I'm surprised you make a reference to them. I just want to know how you take this sense.
The reason why I refer to the Maccabees is because in Daniel 11 you find also references to them. Daniel 11, where we have in verse, let's start from verse 30. In the middle of verse 30, or let's start from the beginning. For verse 30, for ships of Kittim shall come. That is a reference to the Roman Empire. Against him, that's still the king of the north. And he shall be grieved and return. Well, that is what I said earlier. That is Antiochus Epiphanes. You have to read the whole chapter, Daniel 11, to see that connection. And have indignation against the Holy Covenant. He was so humiliated by the Romans, and then he was so mad that he poured his madness on Jerusalem against the Holy Covenant. And it says, will practice. And he shall return and direct his attention to those that forsake the Holy Covenant. He made a deal with apostate Jews. We know that from history. And then it says in verse 31, and forces shall stand on his part, that is then the Hellenistic Jews who were in that covenant of verse 30 at the end, and they shall profane the sanctuary. So he used apostate Jews to cooperate with his plans, and then it says in the middle of verse 31, the fortress, and shall take away the continual sacrifice. That's what they did. And they shall place the abomination that makes desolate. So that was what I referred to, that pig that was placed in the temple. Then verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he pervert by flattery. So that was the covenant that he made with these apostate Jews. But then notice verse 32. But the people that know their God shall be strong. That was the early Maccabees. The early Maccabees. They were very faithful Jews. And they revolted against the king of the north. And God was with them, because this verse says that the people that know their God shall be strong and shall act. That is what you really find in the Maccabees. And then it says, they that are wise among the people shall instruct the many, and they shall fall by the sword. We find that also then how among them there was a sifting. Now, and that's why I said this also is at the same time an illustration of the future remnant who will suffer a lot. At the beginning, before the king will reign, like the apostate king, Antichrist will set himself in the temple of God. Before that will occur, before that there will be suffering by that remnant. Similarly to the Maccabees. And that is why I had liberty to compare this with Zechariah 9 and see the first fulfillment in the Maccabees, thy sons, O Judah. But then I already said the complete fulfillment must be future, because you also see here from Ephraim, that's the 10 tribes. So that could not be yet the complete fulfillment in the days of the Maccabees.